Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're actually going to get started right now, right away. So welcome back to the Northeast Regional Conference. This is the Engaging with Progressives workshop. So if that's what you're looking for, you have come to the right place. And if you haven't already, definitely let us know where you're joining from, and then post one word or an associated phrase in the chat that comes up for you when I say progressives. And we're going to get started. So, well, I say that. Okay, I'm going to start off by introducing myself. My name is Paige Dedrick. I'm a New York State co-coordinator. I'm a chapter lead of the Buffalo Niagara chapter and a liaison to Representative Brian Higgins. I am personally from arguably the most conservative district in the Northeast. My representative was previously Chris Collins, the first member of Congress to endorse Donald Trump for president in 2016, and now the seat is held by Chris Jacobs. New York 27 is super rural, really staunchly conservative, but I myself am a progressive lefty, and the congressman that I'm a liaison to is a Democrat from like the very dark blue Buffalo, New York. So all of that is to say that I know a thing or two about messaging to both sides, but I am definitely not an expert on this. I think it's generally new for a lot of us. I've been thinking about how to work with progressives and how to engage progressives in our CCL work for a long time. And I'm really excited to speak with you today. Hopefully we can all learn something. I've run this workshop only one time before. And so, any feedback you have is most welcome. A lot of this information is borrowed and reformatted, from the CCL Core Volunteer Training, a progressive training module that's available on CCL's website, and some work that's been done by progressives across the country. So I can definitely get you source material if you're interested in diving deeper, or we can create some together. So yeah, lots to build on here. Katya is collecting questions in the chat. So as we go through, please make sure that if you have a question, something comes up for you, definitely type it down, and hopefully we'll have, as long as I move along swiftly, 10 full minutes at the end to just sort of like talk, discuss, hash it out, do our Q&A. So definitely type stuff in the chat so Katya can capture it for us. We're going to talk about the following things today in the next 30 minutes. So first, we're going to define our terms. I'm going to speak briefly about the climate action ecosystem. And then we'll start to do what I'm calling rethinking our thinking and our approach when it comes to progressives in general and how we do our work with CCL. Then we will go through some specific thoughts I've had on how to engage progressives and that stuff that's worked for others. And then I'll have some very limited next steps. And then we'll dedicate about, hopefully, 7 to 10 minutes to questions. And like I said, Katya is monitoring that. So please, as they occur to you, type them in the chat and we'll see if any themes come up. And our goals for this training is that I hope we'll leave the next 30 minutes together, 40 minutes together as a group that has a broader understanding of our progressive partners, some idea on how to shift and tailor our messaging to our progressive allies, that you'll feel like empowered and prepared to do this work, that you'll be able to identify and think about points of overlap and connectedness between CCL and progressive objectives, and that maybe you'll even have sort of shifted some of your goals in the way that you've been thinking about working with progressives. We are not going to be able to get to all of the answers because each relationship with a progressive partner is different, and that's the key point. This work is really going to take a lot of personal relationship building. And also the other thing that we're not going to have time for is really covering the climate and environmental justice movement in depth. I'm going to touch on that, but that is not what this training is about. And now this is your last chance to type a word that you associate with progressives into the chat. And in a moment, we're going to read them. So get it in if you haven't already. And Katya, if you could unmute yourself and just read like 3 or 5 things that people said about progressives.
Yeah, so I saw America's Majority a couple of times, action-oriented, market skeptic, confident, multicultural, and forward-thinking.
Awesome. I think all of those things are true. I'm especially interested in getting to talking about America's majority at the end of this. So if you said that, I'd love to talk about that during the discussion component. Awesome. So I'm going to ask you to free associate one more time. And I'd like you to imagine an ecosystem. So type a word that comes up for you in the chat when I say ecosystem. And maybe you're thinking of a lake or the edge of a riverbed or a forest or a prairie, your backyard, whatever. Think of your favorite ecosystem and drop in the chat a word that comes to mind. I'm going to wait like 20 seconds for you guys to do that. So. Oh, wow. People are so fast, amazing. Katya, do you feel ready to read some of these responses back to me? Awesome.
Yep. Vibrant, balanced, interconnected, harmony, watershed, integrated, interconnected, my gut.
Awesome. Okay, cool. So what stood out to me there is vibrant and interconnected. Those are two words that actually came up for me as well. Also dynamic, complex, a community, collaborative. So obviously we as environmentalists are very familiar with ecosystem thinking, and I invite you, if you are not already, to imagine the climate movement as an ecosystem, which is to say it needs to be cooperative, interdependent, connected. The organizations that work in this space are all part of this climate action ecosystem. And I know that this is something that Danny Richter talks about a lot, but I think it bears repeating that there is a lot of important work going on in the environmental movement, and that might look like stopping harmful air pollution or trying to create momentum for and pass a Green New Deal. And those are important and valuable. And CCL has a niche within the larger ecosystem, and that is to create bipartisan policy solutions at a federal level. So it is our role to create common ground and respectful dialogue between people who disagree in order to build common cause for climate solutions. And CCL is part of a vital and complicated living movement ecosystem. And I think that if we take that thinking with us forward, it's going to make our work easier. So why do we care about the ecosystem? This might seem obvious, but I know how hard CCLers work, and if we could solve this problem on our own, it would already be solved. So, you know, the other reasons are appeal to progressive lawmakers. Like, there are many progressives in Congress, and we need to make sure that they view us as legitimate and actual partners. Additionally, infighting within movements is really not a good look publicly. So we need to try to speak with one voice as an environmental movement, or at least not argue with each other, bash each other, make risks, et cetera. So it's really critical that we become and continue to be a good partner within this climate movement ecosystem. And also, lots of CCLers are progressive. So it's really important for us to be able to talk to our own communities, our own friends about the work that we're doing and to feel convinced and inspired by that work. And I want to drive home a point that I think is super critical about this ecosystem thinking that CCL is a part of, climate and environmental justice activists are a part of, progressive lawmakers are a part of this ecosystem. We can't do this work without the other work of other activists within the ecosystem. And this picture shows the day in November 2018 that Sunrise occupied Nancy Pelosi's office. Many of you may or may not remember, but CCL was also on the Hill that day. We were there, and I remember being like a little annoyed because, hey, CCLers are here too, and we're also doing good work, and like our branding isn't as cool, and we're not doing a sit-in, but like we're not getting this kind of coverage, and AOC isn't coming to our meetings, and like what the heck is going on? And so I just felt a little bit like, ugh. But what happened after that November day, when Sunrise demanded action and so did CCL, is that we got a carbon pricing bill, like, you know, a month and a half later, we got a carbon pricing bill. And no one said we made this bill because Sunrise did this and CCL did that, and that's how we got to this place. But I really do think that our complementary actions yielded results. And so when we work together, we can really push the ball forward. There's a super critical part of this ecosystem that I'm not going to have time to address today, and that's the climate and environmental justice movement. I want to make clear that this is different than engaging with progressives. I think sometimes we conflate the two terms. Just because someone is a progressive does not mean that they are aligned or organizing by CEJ principles. I'm going to give you a really brief definition of what climate and environmental justice is and a place to start on this work if you're interested in it. So climate justice begins with recognizing key groups are differently affected by climate change. Climate justice recognizes that the impacts of climate change will not be borne equally or fairly, and that climate impacts exacerbate existing inequitable social conditions. Climate justice advocates for low-income communities, people of color, indigenous people, people with disabilities, elderly people, women. All of these groups are susceptible to risks posed by climate like flooding or extreme cold like we're seeing in Texas, or wildfire, or poor air quality, or access to food and water. And organizations within the climate justice ecosystem put race, gender, and class at the very center of their action discussions. And the reason that we're not going to really be able to talk about CEJ today is twofold. The first is time, and the breadth of the conversation is enormous. And the second is that I'm just not an appropriate presenter to speak on climate and environmental justice issues. I am not an expert. If you're interested in doing that work and you think that that's the best way for you to build bridges within the environmental, the climate movement ecosystem, please join the CEJ action team on CCL. They're going to be able to help support your efforts to get involved in climate justice in your own community. They would love more membership, and it's a great resource. So please, please do that. And I will make sure that you know how to get there if you're looking for that action team. Okay, so we have established that the ecosystem work is really critical. I would like to now transition back to learning a bit about what our progressive partners in the climate action ecosystem believe. I'm going to define what progressive elected officials believe and assume that others who identify as progressives believe roughly the same thing. But remember, a progressive that you would want to engage with or build a relationship with could be your friend who cares about climate change but is active in a progressive group that supports LGBTQIA teens, or your neighbor who is a member of a local environmental justice organization, or it could be a local climate organization. It could also be your progressive member of Congress. And a great way to engage with your MOC is to engage progressive constituents and community leaders. So you should really try to expand who the progressives are that you're talking about. A progressive member of Congress supports the following principles. This is if they are a member of the Progressive Caucus, they have supported the statement, government of the people, by the people, and for the people, not just the powerful and privileged, fairness for all. That's the progressive promise. And in addition to that, they often, a progressive member of Congress would support the following: economic justice and security, protecting and preserving civil rights and security, promoting global peace, advancing environmental protection and energy independence. And also they would try to focus on the climate crisis as a central tenet of action. So I would first like to really acknowledge that many Progressive Caucus members do support the EICDA. Of the 86 co-sponsors that we had at the end of the last Congress, 40 were also members of the Progressive Caucus. I think sometimes we don't acknowledge the major overlap that there already is between our two causes, excuse me. That said, there is a gap, and part of the gap seems to be the breadth and depth that a progressive might be looking for in climate legislation. There's a great deal that progressive lawmakers and also progressives in general would like to see coming out of climate legislation, and reducing greenhouse gas emissions is just one of those areas. And that's what we really work on. So you can see that what a progressive climate agenda might look like is like this big orange bubble that I have on the screen. And definitely reducing greenhouse gas emissions, fits into that bubble, but it's not the entire thing. So we have to be really respectful of the gap between what we're working on and what a progressive might be looking for. And I'd like to take a moment to just talk honestly about that gap. Perhaps you have all had similar experiences to the one that I'm about to share with you. But sometimes our conversations with progressives don't go the greatest. And here's one from my own life. I was invited by a friend to be a participant in a panel discussion featuring like really great progressive women from Buffalo and Western New York. And at that brunch, I was introduced to one of my absolute idols, like a local leader who I just thought was the coolest, very powerful local progressive woman who I honestly have fangirled over for a long time. I have, read her Twitter. I know every blog post she's ever written. I'm sure she has no idea who I am, but I knew who she was. I was really excited to speak with her and also to be on the panel with her because she's an executive director of a very innovative and creative local environmental nonprofit. And I thought tons of opportunities for overlap here. I can't wait to talk to her. And when we were introduced, I immediately said I worked on carbon pricing. And I just watched her face shift from openness and excitement to just like distrust and reservation. Like I saw it happen. And she responded with something like, not like that nonsense in Washington state though, right? And I was just like, oh, I felt my heart just fall through my feet. And I was really disappointed, super hurt. And of course, what I jumped to doing was trying to explain to her all the ways that carbon fee and dividend was actually awesome. And I tried to refute her claims point by point. And I tried to take the conversation in the direction that I wanted it to go in. And the conversation just kind of went nowhere. And I didn't get a chance to make my points. I definitely didn't make a good connection. We have not had a friendship since. And so that was a pretty disempowering experience for both of us, I would say, but especially for me. And I definitely didn't like move the ball on carbon pricing. So I've been thinking a lot as I was putting together this presentation about how that conversation could have gone differently. And I also think very often about CCL's core values: focus, optimism, relationships, integrity, personal power, nonpartisanship, and diversity. And I think in that conversation, the value that I embodied was focus. And I think I did that a little bit too much. I was a little too focused on what I wanted the conversation to look like. And I think I should have been thinking more about relationships. I could have tried to make a connection there instead of communicating my point of view. I could have asked her questions or been interested in her concerns about carbon pricing, laying aside the fact that I wanted her to like approve of what I was doing or what I worked on. I could have just asked her tell me about your concerns with carbon pricing. Or perhaps even better, I could have asked her what she does and asked her what she works on and why she believes it's effective. So I think that when we think about working with our progressive partners, really, really remembering what Mark Reynolds always says, we're betting the ranch on relationships, is the key. Respectful dialogue will create shift. And when we embody the CCL way of respect, appreciation, and gratitude, we're better able to communicate, and that will build relationships. I think it's really, really critical to remember that building progressive support is actually very similar to building conservative support, because when we build relationships and use language that they can hear, we immediately, then we can trust each other and actually work together. We need to, listen, I think, a little bit better. So here are some more tangible thoughts I have about building relationships with progressives. The first is we need to signal our flexibility. Our bottom line is reducing emissions while protecting low-income American households. Our bottom line is not carbon fee and dividend. We think carbon fee and dividend is the best way to do that. It's the fastest way to do that. But you don't always have to enter a conversation saying CF&D and waving our CF&D flag. If you think that it's more beneficial to start with our shared values, I encourage you to do that. The second thing that I've been thinking a lot about is slowing down and focusing on relationships. So this is going to mean moving away from the endorsement mindset, which has been really powerful for CCL in a lot of different avenues, and into a relationship building mindset, focusing on relationships. How do you want your member or your progressive friend or your organizational contact to actually feel about who you are as a person, and not focusing on what we want from them or they want from you? CCL is super outcome oriented, and I'm not trying to bash the way we have done things, because the laser focus is extremely critical in a lot of ways. And I think that it's moved the ball enormously on climate action. But when we work with progressives and build relationships with other organizations, we may jump too quickly to sharing information about HR 763 and how powerful it is, without first truly understanding that other person's point of view. So this work is going to just take time. Building relationships is going to take patience and honesty and honest interest in other perspectives and other ideas. So if we can shift our view of outcomes from endorsements or co-sponsorship to building relationships and making sure people feel valued and feel that we're trustworthy, I think that that is the really critical shift. Related is this idea of communicating instead of connecting. So I'm going to just do a little role play with myself, so bear with me. But imagine I just moved into a new neighborhood. It's awesome. I love my neighbors. They're super cool. And I can tell that they really care about their homes and they're like caring for the things around them. I am so happy to live here. I've been watching my neighbor Rob across the street. I see him in his workshop like once or twice a week, working on building a picnic table. And I've never met Rob, but I go over and I knock on his door and I say, "Hi, I'm your brand new neighbor from across the street. We've never met. I can tell that you're super great at woodwork. And I can see that you're building a picnic table because I watch you from my window. And I want to add a deck to my house. And I'm wondering if you're going to come, would you be willing to come help me build my deck?" None of us would do that. Like, that is not a normal way to interact with people. So perhaps a better way would have been, "Hi, I'm your new neighbor. Would you want to get coffee sometime? I've heard that you love woodwork and I love woodwork and I just love to talk about it and maybe, exchange some tips." And if we become friends, maybe a couple of months down the line, Rob would be really happy to help me with my deck. I think that sometimes when we're interacting with progressives, because they are such natural allies and we can see that we have goals that are so similar, we skip to the part where we ask for something from them before we establish the relationship. So definitely focusing on connecting instead of communicating is a good mental shift to make as well. And then the final thought, and this comes from Taylor Krause, who works at the CCL national level, is a thought on silence and sort of respecting boundaries. So there are a number of groups that oppose the Energy Innovation Act, and some are vocally opposed and others are quietly opposed. And if a group that you're seeking support from or a working relationship from isn't out front with their support or isn't comfortable signing on publicly or doesn't want to collaborate, then being quiet isn't actually a bad thing for the movement, especially because public disagreement, like I said, can really detract from the larger shared goal of addressing the negative impacts of climate change. So we're really trying to build a bridge for as many people as possible to collaborate and communicate. That doesn't mean that everyone has to be on the bridge, but there's like people who might want to tear down the bridge because they think the bridge is inherently bad, or people who are like, okay, that bridge is fine, I'm not going to cross it, but it can be there. We want to be in a place where we're all really respecting the goal and the values that we share. So we want to be the place where as many people as possible come together to collaborate. But if an organization is being silent or hasn't responded to a couple of your emails, or your friend is like, not for me, leave them alone. Definitely respect those boundaries. Some people just aren't going to support the bill and they're working on other things, and that is totally fine and valuable. Here is one of my favorite ways of talking to progressives. Like I said, many progressives are already allies, and that's because we care about the same thing. So we really want to reduce greenhouse gases, right? There's lots and lots of benefits to that, but progressives are our natural allies for sure. But remember, that's only one of the things that progressives advocate for. So it's really critical to bridge that gap that I was talking about earlier between what CCLers are working on and what progressives are advocating for and working on. So one of the ways to bridge that gap is to focus on the yes and approach. I like to use it because if someone says, I think legislation should do X, Y, and Z, you can acknowledge that, say, yes, we absolutely should have legislation that does that. And we should also have the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. And that's a simple tool, but it could be a really powerful way to move the conversation along. Additionally, finding points of connection could look like, just find points of connection in your conversations, which could look like areas of common ground, like focusing on the health benefits that come from reducing greenhouse gases, focusing on the efficacy of a carbon tax in reducing greenhouse gases, or focusing on how quickly and relatively simple it would be to implement the EICDA. These are all points that you could absolutely get a progressive to agree with. And then finally, to use yes and as a rhetorical tool, you need to be curious and interested and not interesting. And I think that that's also really critical. Asking people what they do care about so that they can tell us what their values are and what they're working on is a great way to then say, wow, I think that's great. I'm also working on this, and you can have the conversation flow in that way. We also need to remember to highlight our shared values. As I have said, I think this is something that CCLers are pretty practiced at with conservatives, but we don't always offer progressives that same sort of comfort. So when people talk about the concerns they have, we need to remember to speak to those underlying values that the concerns are coming from. So you might hear, well, Republicans or big oil support a carbon price, and if they support it, I know that it's bad. And that could shut the conversation right down, or you could try to identify the shared value there. So I know that oil companies have a history of sometimes being deceitful, and I definitely recognize that there's a lot of pain around the way that big oil and petroleum have treated communities of color and poor communities. Something oil companies are definitely good at, though, is innovating to protect their bottom line. And we need all the innovation we can get right now. Oil companies know that climate change needs to be addressed, and luckily they won't be able to avoid the carbon tax. But they can innovate clean sources of energy, which will help drive our entire grid and economy in that direction more efficiently. Could I share with you about what Janet Yellen and other economists say about carbon taxes? So there's just a different way to highlight a shared value. And I think, if what they're saying resonates with you, acknowledge that, absolutely. And you don't have to be so stringently nonpartisan in your conversations with your progressive partners if you yourself are a progressive. Another thing that we can do is to find these points of connection, right? So highlight the benefits of our bill and not just the features of our bill. Sometimes we say things like, the EICDA starts at $15 a ton and goes up $10 a ton per year unless we don't meet our goals, which is totally true. And that might work for some people. But a different way to say something is, it's effective, putting the US on a path to reduce our emissions by at least 40% in the first 12 years. And that kind of messaging may speak much more strongly to a progressive than just saying the features of the bill. So another way to talk about the features of the bill is it puts a price on carbon and returns a dividend to households. I think we often use that, especially when we're speaking to progressives, because it has that sort of protection mechanism. We see the dividend as being a good and progressive part of our bill. But it may be just as effective or even more effective to say something like, it's good for people, improving health and saving lives by reducing harmful pollution that Americans breathe. So that's definitely a point of connection with a progressive. Okay, we are fast approaching the time when I would like to pause and have a little bit more of a discussion. And I see lots of comments in the chat, so we'll get to that. So here are my closing thoughts as they are thus far on how to communicate and engage with progressives. First, the work of building coalitions with our progressive allies is is not the work of seeking and procuring endorsements. It is actually the work of building trust and respectful relationships. And we can just remain centered in our values of CCL. The respect and appreciation and gratitude for the work that's already going on is something that we're super familiar with as CCLers. And as in any good relationship, we need to listen to people and identify their concerns, respect those concerns, and develop our answers to them.